Miami's offense has been a sore spot for years. It can never entirely be counted on. But what's the root of the problem? We break down the stats and if it's a matter of scheme, personnel, coaching, or a combination of factors. And more importantly, how can they fix the problem? We'll answer that on today's episode of Locked On Heat.
You are Locked On Heat, your daily Miami Heat podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Heat, your everyday podcast on the Miami Heat, whether you're tuning in on YouTube, Odyssey, or your favorite podcast app. Thanks for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day, Monday to Friday. I'm Wes Goldberg, editor at allyoucanheat.com, here with David Ramil, both of us credentialed Heat media members. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. We're going to be zooming out and asking, I think, one of the biggest on-the-court questions facing the Heat next season. Beyond the Jimmy Butler drama, beyond the draft, beyond of all the stuff that we've been focusing so much of our attention on. And that's how they can improve the league's 21st ranked offense from last season. We'll talk about Erik Spoelstra's scheme, some of the personnel questions. But first, when we do have this discussion about the Heat's offense from last season, David, what to you was the biggest problem?
Well, it's an inconsistency, I think. You look at some of the comments that players made following the season, the fact that there were players in and out of the lineup and no established rhythm over time, players that just, even when they were there, weren't necessarily producing at a high level. You have players coming in and off from the injury list. And I just think you look at what the offense, it's just undefinable, like a nebulous mess of inconsistency that's based on poor performance from personnel, but also the fact that there were players that were missing constantly throughout the season, and you couldn't establish any sort of rhythm. So if that's how I'd describe it anyway.
A nebulous mess of inconsistency is probably not what they were going for, I would imagine.
Going into
last season. But it was.
That's not the pitch to season ticket holders. That's for sure. Come check it out.
Yeah.
Nebulous mess.
That's our catchphrase.
Yeah.
It always felt, and that's not even just the injuries, it felt like they never really had an identity to begin with, because maybe they were planning on that identity being partly based on Damian Lillard being on the roster. And they go into training camp, they never land Damian Lillard, they never land a star, they make no real major improvements to the roster, and you walk into training camp, and we didn't even know if Kyle Lowry was the starting point guard or not. You remember that was the big drama coming out of Boca Raton. And you've got that. We don't know who the starting power forward is, and I would just imagine that because of all this, whatever planning Erik Spoelstra had done, it felt to me that maybe it was a little bit more on the fly than he would have preferred, considering that he didn't even know who the starting point guard was going to be, right?
Sure.
And I think that was a big factor in it. And then I also think that this team, they had to rely on the others way too much, because Jimmy Butler played 60 games because of all these injuries and whatever the availability concerns were. And yeah, he showed up for 60 games, but he played like a number one star, like your ace scorer, I don't know, 30 to 40 of those games. Yeah, exactly. So you're constantly relying on guys like Bam Adebayo and Tyler Hero, and he was available, and he only played 42 games all year. You know, you make the big trade for you trade Lowry out, go get Terry Rozier. He plays a handful of games for you before he gets hurt. There's games where you're relying on Jaime Jaquez to be the lead scorer like he was on Christmas, and it was never one guy, and they never really had that one player. And I say this all the time, but you can ask all these guys to step up, and the next man up thing is great, but it doesn't work. You don't win championships by next man upping the entire way through the season. You need star players to play like star players and be available for a majority of those games and play like it for a majority of those games. And I thought that they didn't have that. And not to keep putting everything on Jimmy Butler, but how many times would we get on a post-game show and we would kind of do the blame pie thing, and I would just start with Jimmy Butler and I would end with Jimmy Butler, because when he wasn't available or wasn't playing like a star, it just felt an inordinate. Did I get that? Inordinate?
Yeah, inordinate.
Just gonna speed right through it. Amount of responsibility was sort of being handed down to guys on the roster who are not capable of being that kind of player.
Yeah, it's the same problems over and over again. Like Jimmy would go and have the occasional game, and I remember the kind of refrain as we were doing these recaps. It's like, oh, Jimmy showed up tonight. Jimmy played. Jimmy led the way, etc. But that was very, very rarely the case. It was like, oh, okay, Jimmy did just enough, and then Bam had a good game. Or unfortunately, Jimmy wasn't there. Bam really wasn't there. Maybe they got a good performance from Duncan Robinson or Jaime Jaquez or some other surprise performance from a role player that led to a loss. And that's, that was the theme of the whole season. So, I talked about it in yesterday's episode, the need for a hierarchy, the need for a 1A type player in offense. And I think that's pretty clearly the case. To your point about training camp, I don't even know if it was necessarily the point guard or the power forward or anything like that, but just the idea that who's going to lead this team, who's going to carry this team. And maybe Jimmy felt slighted at the idea of Miami bringing in Damian Lillard. I'd never even considered that, but maybe he kind of just said, you know what, I was never going to the front office approached the season with the idea that maybe I wasn't going to be the top scorer of the team, and that's why they went after Dame. Well, then maybe I just won't necessarily show up as consistently. I don't know.
He's never been the top scorer. I actually think he was upset that they did. I don't think he wants to be the top scorer. My read on Jimmy Butler all the time is he wants the other guys to be the top scorer so he could do the things on the court. And unfortunately, those guys aren't capable of being those guys. They're good players. They're not number one scorers on a championship contending team, right? Those are two very different things. Damian Lillard, on paper, was that kind of player, and I think could have been that player for Miami, for the record. Despite how disappointing his season may have been for Milwaukee.
A lot of revisionist history after, the disappointing season in Milwaukee. It's especially with Drew Holiday having a big game in the finals. And now everybody's like, oh, Milwaukee really screwed the pooch on that one by trading Holiday. And maybe they
the right trade.
Yeah, I think I agree.
They screwed up in not making it a 3-team deal and making sure Drew Holiday didn't just go to the one team that they couldn't afford him to go to was their biggest problem. I've got some stats in terms of what else was wrong with Miami's offense. Like we said, 21st in offensive rating, scoring 113.3 points per game. It's not good enough. The 3-pointers, we focus a lot on that in terms of how many they got up. But they were still 19th in 3-pointers made, which you'd like that to be a little bit higher. But I was looking at cleaning on the glass, and they were 3rd in frequency of 3-point attempts. The reason they don't get on a big portion of their attempts, most of them are 3-pointers. The problem is that they just don't have as many possessions as you'd want in an NBA game. They were 28th in overall field goal attempts. The frequency of their attempts is really high, but they're very low in pace. They don't get a bunch of attempts up, and so I think that's a little bit of a problem. To me, it starts with the fact that they couldn't get to the rim. They 19.8%, so less than 20% of their overall attempts were at the basket. 28th in the NBA. That's awful. And they needed to figure out a way to improve that. I think that's why they went ahead and traded for Terry Rozier, because internally they understood this and they acknowledged it. And Kyle Lowry just wasn't getting to the basket, and Terry Rozier was one of the best drivers in the NBA, at least statistically. And so they went out and made that move. It didn't really work just because, again, there were so many other availability issues with Rozier and across the rest of the roster. But that, to me, is the number that if you're looking to improve anything, that's the one even before the 3-point shooting. That's the one to me. You got to get to the rim. You can't afford to make your entire offense those 10 to 15-foot short-range, mid-range jumpers. That's not an efficient offense. You got to get to the basket more.
Yeah, I mean, it creates so much other opportunity for everything. Like, you can have those wide-open 3-point shots. You can have multiple actions off that first drive that kind of greases the wheels offensively, makes things easier without any kind of supremely dominant scorer. Unfortunately, this wasn't the case. You didn't have any kind of easy offense. How many possessions did we see where it was kind of over dribbling, looking, poking, prodding, trying to see if you might find an opening defensive scheme somewhere, not really finding one, nobody really creating.
Wasn't even poking and prodding. It was like tickling. It was like tickling the defense, because they weren't even like poking would suggest some sort of ability to get into the paint. It's just tickling the defense.
Not go ahead there. This is already, I've opened a can of worms here. No, you're absolutely right. It wasn't exactly the most effective offense, and it was aesthetically hideous. Like, I mean, there were a number of games there where it was just like, I just want a blowout, and I feel like I've been saying this for years. Like, you want a game where it's like, wow, 120 something points, 130 points, and holding an opponent somehow to under 100. That would be great. And I think that happened like once, maybe twice over the course of the season. There were a few blowouts that I can remember off the top of my head. Not a lot. And Yeah, it was mostly due to really bad offense. Their defense isn't the problem. For all the concerns about everybody, and I'm surprised over the course of the season how many people said, "Oh, defensively they're a problem," and yet somehow they wind up still, regardless of personnel, and maybe it's just the Heat culture or the Heat ethos or whatever you want to call it, but they somehow still managed to wind up turning in a fantastic defense despite all the inconsistency with the roster. But it's the offense that's just bogged down this team for multiple seasons now.
Too many empty possessions, too many possessions without a real plan. And I think part of that is because they lack the hierarchy. I think that was probably, I would say 80% of that. And just like, we talk about the passing and the ball movement, and they do so many of those things, but so much of it is just aesthetically, that's all it is. It's not actually accomplishing anything. It's just passing it from side to side, nobody really making the defense rotate or react or anything like that. And that's because they don't have that A1 score. Didn't have that A1 score for so much of their season that there's nobody that is able to force those kinds of things onto the defense.
I don't know if this is even a statistic they can show. I wonder which team led the league in shot clock violations, because I would warrant that Miami might not necessarily, but just because of lack of possessions, but I think they would certainly be up there. Like, and just teams that just went through 24 seconds and were like, oh, did we have to do something at the end of this time? Because we still hadn't figured it out yet. We were getting to it. Just give us a little bit more time. It's like, no, that's not how it works. Yeah.
So they do have a stat for shot clock tracking, and the Heat were second in the league in field goal attempts within the last 4 seconds of the shot clock.
That kind of backs that up. It's like, oh, damn, we're at the 20-second mark.
Just put it up, throw it up. Tyler, here, you do it. That was basically the offense. Not great. Can Erik Spoelstra's scheme need tweaking, and could that help Miami get out of the gutter on offense? We'll talk about that next here on Locked On Heat.
Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Summertime means baseball. Well, maybe outside of Miami, but anywhere else in the United States, it probably means baseball. The NBA Finals and more, and of course the NHL Finals. You can bet on all of that over at FanDuel. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 you can use to bet on everything from the Finals MVP to who's going to hit one out of the park. That Finals MVP question is getting more and more muddled. At least it's clear it's not Jason Tatum. But other than that, right now, I think you have multiple options on the Boston side of things, and I don't know that there's a clear perspective.
I would still put my money on Jason Tatum, and here's why. He's not going to deserve it, but the media is going to feel bad for him. I'm serious. This is not even a hot take. And they're going to give it to Tatum. No, because everything you hear out of the national media and the Boston media is like, yeah, but he's not scoring, but look at his screen setting and the rebounding and the passing, and he had 12 assists. I'm like, fine. Okay.
He's not impacting. He is impacting the game in other ways, and that's
but
fine.
Not enough for a Finals MVP. But they're going to I'm telling you, they're going to give it to him anyway.
No, that's not going to happen.
Marcus Smart got a Defensive Player of the Year award because the media just felt like they needed to give it to him.
That was a little bit more deserving than a guy who averaged, like, I don't even know what his averages for the Finals are so far through 2 games, but
it's going to be near. They're going to say it's a near triple-double, though. I'm telling you.
Does that include turnovers? I don't know. Anyway, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and add a big win to your summer bucket list. That's FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. We'll be right back.
Thanks for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day. Make sure you're subscribed on YouTube and on your favorite podcast app. We're on the road to 14,000 subscribers, and we are almost there, 400 or 500 subscribers away. So if you're watching us on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. While you're here, also hit that like button. All right, I want to start this segment. We're going to talk about Erik Spoelstra. I want to start this segment with a quote from Erik Spoelstra from his availability after the season. He was asked about how Miami could improve the offense, and he said, quote, "That's what I will have to get to work on. The coaching staff will get together quite a bit to try to put together a more productive offensive plan. We had basically 3 primary offensive philosophies this season and a lot last season based on who was available," end quote. I found that really interesting, and we could try to figure out what 3 philosophies he was really talking about. That to me is less interesting than the fact that he had to basically change the offense as the season was going on, kind of toggling in between these different philosophies based on whether or not Jimmy Butler was playing or Tyler Hero was playing or whoever else he might have had available. He might have there might have been one scheme where it was everybody was there. I think maybe he was also hinting at Kyle Lowry was the point guard, and then it was Terry Rozier that was the point guard. There's a lot of different reasons. But going back to the availability point, and I feel like we're just beating a dead horse right now, but it would be nice to just have your guys available and you could just run one system. Because I think about the other teams in the league who's like, yeah, I know exactly what that team is trying to do on every possession. I know exactly what that offensive philosophy is. I think about teams like the Sacramento Kings, right? They're not the most successful team, but I know exactly what they're trying to do offensively on every single possession. Two-man game, De'Aaron Fox, Domantas Sabonis. Well, they've been extremely healthy, those two guys, the last 2 years under Mike Brown. That's a big part of that. The Oklahoma City Thunder, I know exactly what they're trying to do on every single possession. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, drive to the basket, kick out, second side attackers, drive, kick, boom, boom. They were wildly healthy all season long and had one of the best offenses in the league. The Boston Celtics with their 5-out offense, wildly healthy all season long. It starts with health, right? And you can only do so much. And I'm kind of glad that Spo and some of the other players talked about this after the year, where they all season said, next man up. It doesn't matter who we have available. We have enough. And at the end of the year, they're basically like, well, we never really had enough, obviously. And I don't blame them for saying that because they were a first round out team because they were so injured.
I'm gonna disagree. I don't know if this is a hot take necessarily, but I'm gonna disagree with the notion that availability was the defining factor there, because going to the point that I made in the first segment, I think Miami can keep a defensive ethos, an idea, a scheme, whatever you want to call it, and they were able to implement that as consistently as possible. Again, this team was a top defense regardless of who was out there. The problem is that on offense is that you have multiple players with multiple different views on what the offense should be like. Whether you have Niko Jovic pushing the ball, Jaime Jaquez trying to fly through, defensive player, or Jimmy bringing the ball up slowly, Bam kind of wanting to know whether or not he should post up or shoot that mid-range, or maybe set the high screen and kind of work with Duncan on the three. There's all these different things, which of course you can account for different ideas offensively, but I think you just have a conflict of different players. I mean, I didn't even mention Tyler Hero, but I think Tyler's offense doesn't necessarily mesh well with Jimmy's offense, which doesn't necessarily mesh well with Niko Jovic, et cetera, et cetera. And so
or
you
Bam's
have
offense, yeah.
Or Bam, yeah. So you have this idea of like all these different players that want to play offense in their own way, and it doesn't work because you're never on the same page, unless it's the playoffs and it's give Jimmy the ball and we'll kind of just play off that. It doesn't work. And in the regular season, you had too many differing styles and not anything consistently manifesting as a result of those different styles.
I would argue that the reason they were able to still be successful defensively, despite the availability concerns, is that Bam Adebayo is the anchor of the defense, and he was available. He was there for 71 games, and another one of these guys who wasn't available, Tyler Hero, is a liability on that end, right? And so that almost helps them defensively. Now it hurts them offensively. I'm not, me, I'm not going to sit here and argue that the team is better without Tyler Hero, but there's something to be said about, hey, now we just kind of allocate these minutes more to Caleb Martin and Haywood Highsmith and some of these guys who are a little bit better defensively, Josh Richardson, etc. But I think the availability part hurt. I do think that it might be a little overstated. I think I might agree with you a little bit too, because I never felt like even when this team was really available, it was awesome offensively. And so I'm more concerned about even when this team is available.
Yeah.
Sort of
what are they trying to do?
What are they trying to do? And these players don't fit well together. They don't. Yeah. There's a world where they could, but the problem with Bam is that he's a mid-range shooter. He doesn't get to the basket that much. The problem with Tyler Hero is he's a mid-range shooter. He doesn't get to the basket that much. And they've been trying to get him to be more of a catch-and-shoot three-point guy, and there's like weeks and days where he can be that, and then he ends up ultimately reverting back to what he was. Part of that is because of maybe Jimmy Butler is injured again, and he's got to go back to whatever it is. Jimmy Butler is a mid-range shooter. Sometimes he gets to the basket, but he doesn't want to work that hard during the regular season to get to the basket. In the playoffs, that to me is the biggest difference with Jimmy Butler. People always talk about, oh, now he shoots threes in the playoffs. That's fine. I barely care about that. In the playoffs, he stops with the mid-range stuff and he uses his strength and his speed and his first step to get to the basket more than he does in the regular season. That to me is the biggest difference between regular season Jimmy and playoff Jimmy. But you're not getting that consistently throughout the regular season. And here's the weird part, David. For a team that's basically been together in a core three in Bam, Jimmy, and Tyler for half a decade, you would think that there would be a lot more chemistry between those guys than there is. I'm not saying that there's none, but 5 years in the NBA is forever. Like, this team should look like the 2014 San Antonio Spurs, and it doesn't offensively. And it doesn't even come close to that, right? There's almost zero chemistry. I shouldn't say that. There's not nearly as much chemistry as you'd think there'd be, considering the time that they've logged together.
That is a really good point. And even as I'm thinking about this right now, I'm trying to like understand, they've lost key role players in free agency, et cetera. But you're absolutely right. Like, there has just not been any kind of real palpable, consistent chemistry between these teams. And I don't think that's a result of injury, because, let's be honest, like, Steph misses a couple games, even more than that, and he comes back, and maybe there's some physical limitations there. But then, and you covered the team, he comes back in, it's like, oh no, we know exactly what we're going to do, and whether or not he can actually get it done based on his physical limitations, they still have that kind of chemistry, the building block of whatever it is that they're trying to do. And you just don't see that from Miami. It's like kind of just like, you take it, you do something with it. You can't do anything with it. Look for somebody else to go and do something with it. And just
like, the mid-range shot's not open for you. Maybe the mid-range shot's open for you, and that's basically the offense. Like, I'll pass it out. We'll drain the shot clock more, and you give it a try.
It's that Arrested Development meme. It's like, maybe it'll work for us, yeah, right. It never works for anybody else, but maybe it'll work for us.
The problem is, again, the skill sets don't complement each other. Where Draymond Green was built in a basketball lab to play with Steph Curry, and Klay Thompson can play with anybody because he's a 3-and-D shot maker. And all those guys, you've got Steph and Klay who are incredible shooters. Draymond, who's a genius level passer, who's able to get them the ball where they want it, and a great screen setter. Like, those skill sets match. The skill sets in Miami don't really match, and that's why they've been trying to get Tyler Hero to be more of an off-ball player than he's wanted to be, more of a quick decision maker, catch and shoot, get the ball off the screen, do that kind of thing. But even with that, as elite as I think he can be at that job, it still doesn't work between Jimmy and Bam as much as you'd want it to. That two-man game never really got off the ground the way you would expect it to, in a way that even LeBron and Anthony Davis have developed a pick-and-roll chemistry. That doesn't really exist with Jimmy Butler and Bam, in a surprising way, honestly. And that's why Erik Spoelstra, by the way, has so often split those guys up in his rotation patterns. He always leaves one on the court. They quietly do not mesh very well. So I don't know. Maybe that's part of it.
I don't know how quiet it is. It might be actually a lot louder. This doesn't work unless somebody has a shot following that night, or Jimmy's particularly aggressive, etc.
In terms of scheme, though, is there something Erik Spoelstra can do, or is this going to just take improvements to the roster? We're going to talk about that next here on Locked On Heat.
Today's episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. We've talked about this before. It's a difficult time for a lot of people, and sometimes you just want to be able to get something off your chest. You want to talk to a friend or coworker, but maybe you don't necessarily trust their perspective. It might be a little biased. You want something that's a little bit less biased, and if that's the case, you might be thinking about talking to a therapist. And there's a stigma attached to therapy, but it doesn't necessarily need to be one, because the reality is you just want somebody to talk to. That's what a therapist is. You've got some issues, you've got some concerns, you've got something that you want to get off your chest, then you want a therapist. And if you're looking for a therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, it's suited to your schedule, and it really is very, very convenient. You just fill out a brief questionnaire. It takes a matter of minutes, and you get matched with a licensed therapist right away. And you can switch therapists at any time. If your schedule changes, let's say your schedule at work, or let's say something happens at school or with your kids or whatever, and you just want to do something different, then you just get a new therapist, no charge at all. So get it off your chest right now. Go visit BetterHelp. BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA. If you go visit today, you'll get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. We'll be right back.
Thanks for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day. Make sure you're subscribed on YouTube and on your favorite podcast app. Let's just put a bow on the last conversation. Is there something schematically that you'd like to see from Erik Spoelstra going forward?
I don't know how to answer that question, to be honest with you, because this is kind of where it feels like it does rely a little bit on the personnel, and you can't can't force them to do things that they're not used to. Like I'd love to be able to say, you know what, have a much more spread out offense with Jimmy and Bam stretching the floor and having a cutter like Tyler create a mismatch, or Terry Rozier now he's on the roster, and just those things aren't realistic options. So I don't know exactly how to change a scheme based on what you've got, other than just say, guys, while you're out there, take some more threes and try and see if you can make something happen from the perimeter.
I'm glad you said that, because I agree with you, man. I don't know what else Erik Spoelstra is supposed to do. I don't think that there's any doubt that Erik Spoelstra wrings the most out of every roster that he has. It doesn't look pretty because it's not supposed to, because it very rarely is pretty with this group right now. And I understand fans' frustration seeing them score less than 100 points for multiple games in a row and saying, Spoelstra's got to change something, right? But there's only so much you could do. You look at the top offenses in the league, they have star players who are good at elite at something offensively, and the entire offense is built around that skill. And if you don't have a player that is elite at that specific skill, then you can't basically put an offense around that player. So the Heat did not have an elite offensive player all season. Right? They didn't have a single player in the top 40 in points per game. That's crazy for a team that got to the playoffs. It's almost incredible that they got to the postseason, given that stat. So Erik Spoelstra had nothing to work with. I would love to see what Erik Spoelstra could do with a legit top 10 scorer, because this is, for all the fans who are frustrated with Spo and says he needs to modernize the offense and all these things, this is a guy who, when he had elite offensive talent, LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, Chris Bosh, he basically helped lay the foundation for what the modern NBA has become with his inverted offense, going to Oregon, meeting with Chip Kelly. Like he was way ahead of his time with what he was doing with the space. And even he says he could have been a little bit more ahead of his time based on how the league trended after what he did. I remember talking to Steve Kerr when I was covering the Warriors about his offense, and he says, Erik Spoelstra doesn't get enough credit. We base a lot of what we're doing here based on what he was doing with Chris Bosh, what we do with Draymond Green. So give him the elite offensive talent, and let's see what this guy can do. That kind of brings us to our next question, though. Is it just a matter of getting that personnel? I think the answer is yes. It's why we've been spending so much time on this topic this summer so far.
Yeah, no, I'd have to agree. I don't know what that means entirely. A top 10 scorer isn't always the right answer either, because I don't know. Let's say a top 10 scorer in the sense of like Giannis Antetokounmpo. Would he fix Miami's offense?
Yeah.
You think so? Immediately you plug him in and have him kind of do things, because I don't know. Like I given the nature of his offense, the bulk of which is at the line, the bulk of which consists of drives to the hoop, etc. Does that change Miami into a top 5, top 10 offense right away?
I do understand the point you're trying to make, that the fit also matters. It's not just a matter of go get the guy who's averaging 30 points or whatever it is. I think, to me, the baseline I'm looking for is 26 points per game. That's a top 20-ish score in the NBA.
Fair. That's fair.
And if you can but that player also, just like the problem we were talking about, if that player comes in but does not have space anymore because guys like Jimmy Butler and Bam Adebayo are clogging the paint, maybe he cannot be that level scorer anymore. So the fit is going to have to matter here. And it's why, again, they're going after guys like Kevin Durant, Damian Lillard, guys who can space the floor and be those kinds of players. It's why Donovan Mitchell makes so much sense for this roster, whether or not he's going to be available or not. I think one of the things we've learned from these NBA Finals, too, based on Boston's success so far through 2 games and what Dallas has been unable to do through 2 games, is not the need just for one of these guys, but 2 of these guys who complement each other well and can handle the ball and run some offense, who you can run offense through in big moments, right? And the big reason why the Mavericks are here is because Kyrie Irving has been that with Luka Doncic for most of the postseason, and a big reason why the Mavericks are down 0-2 is because Kyrie has been terrible through the first 2 games of the finals. And then you look at Boston, even though they don't have Jason Tatum playing at a high level, they've got Derek White, Jaylen Brown, Drew Holiday, even Kristaps Porzingis, who they're able to run offense through for pockets of the game. Like, they just have so many options. So we're talking about the Heat getting one guy right now. And we don't know if the other guy could be Jimmy Butler, but we don't know what's going to happen with him this offseason. So I don't know. To me, this feels like a team that needs a lot. But you got to, before you get to all that, you got to get the big number 1 guy first and foremost, and then you sort of figure it out after that, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with that. That makes a lot of sense. And Jimmy, he cannot be that guy. He can create some things for himself. And you know what? At this point in his career, and I think this is where a lot of people are stuck, is just the idea of Jimmy is that he should be your top player, which is why we're kind of stuck as we talk about it from a macro level of him getting a contract extension, is that if he wants to get paid as a top player, he can't be a top player anymore. Like, he might not have been a top player on this roster last year. And so you kind of have to get that top player first. And I'd love to see what a Jimmy getting paid a little bit less than what he's asking for, playing off of that type of offensive player would look like. Like, the idea of Jimmy playing off of Donovan Mitchell, I think that would be phenomenal. I think like his opportunities would be great. It would be a lot more fluid. Like, him playing off of a guy like Donovan and still being able to do what he's done so well over the course of his career would be fantastic. It's just, as the lead scorer, it just doesn't work. It's certainly not for 82 games, and certainly not when you miss a handful of those.
There's definitely a domino effect, and it's the same thing. Like, when Jimmy Butler is able to engage in that playoff Jimmy mode, the rest of the roster just looks like it makes so much more sense because Tyler's playing off of Jimmy. Bam's playing off of Jimmy. They're not asked to do this inordinate amount. I screwed it up again.
You're getting stuck on that one.
I can't do it. It's hard.
Let me ask a quick question. Do you think the changing in the refereeing really affected Jimmy's ability to be more impactful? Because we're seeing this throughout the playoffs.
It's such a dumb excuse for this guy. This guy's already physical.
But he's not getting points up because he's just not getting to the free throw line.
I thought he was. I thought Erik Spoelstra basically said it after one post-game press conference. He's got to look to score instead of look to foul. And I do think that hurt guys like him and James Harden and some other guys. But so maybe there's some truth to that, but there's no excuse for that going forward. You know what I mean?
Fair enough. Yeah. If you think it'll be consistent next season too?
It's not number one on the list for me in terms of even like having watched this last season of the things that was. The change in officiating isn't the reason why Jimmy Butler wasn't a top 30 scorer in the league this year. It's maybe on the list, but it's not on the top. It's not my like one of my top 3 items on that list, right? Okay, fair enough. I think it was more just like his level of engagement and effort, and it's exactly what Pat Riley talked about at the end of the year, you know. And it's all those things. So no, I think if you get that number one score, then you can create that pecking order. You can create that domino effect. And by the way, if you do go get that number one score, then I think you just max out Jimmy Butler and you don't even ask the question anymore because even you'd be overpaying him, but you'd at least be keeping the championship window open. And we're talking about year 3 making almost $60 million. I don't care about that because the championship window is open right now. I don't care about 3 years from now. But if you don't get that number one score, then it becomes a lot harder to justify paying Jimmy Butler like a number one option because you don't have a number one option. But I'm okay paying him as an overpaid number 2 option. That's basically what the Celtics have done with Jaylen Brown. And I think it's fine, you know? Yeah. Because you have everything else that makes it work. Little shout Jaylen Brown in there.
Yeah, no kidding.
All right, that'll do it for us today. Thanks for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day. Hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow us on your podcast app.